The decolonization of Africa took place in the mid to late 1950s to 1975. With sudden and radical regime changes on the continent as colonial governments made the transition to independent states, the process was often quite disorganized and marred with violence, political turmoil, widespread unrest, and organized revolts in both northern and sub-Saharan countries, including the Algerian War in French Algeria, the Angolan War of Independence in Portuguese Angola, the Congo crisis in the Belgian Congo, the Mau Mau uprising in British Kenya, and the Nigerian civil war in the secessionist state of Biafra. The scramble for Africa between 1870 and 1900 ended with almost all of Africa being controlled by a small number of European states, racing to secure as much land as possible while avoiding conflict amongst themselves. The partition of Africa was confirmed in the Berlin Agreement of 1885. With little regard to local differences, by 1905, control of almost all African soil was claimed by Western European governments, with the only exceptions being Liberia and Ethiopia. Britain and France had the largest holdings, but Germany, Spain, Italy, Belgium, and Portugal also had colonies. As a result of colonialism and imperialism, a majority of Africa lost sovereignty and control of natural resources such as gold and rubber. The introduction of imperial policies surfacing around local economies led to the failing of local economies due to an exploitation of resources and cheap labor. Progress towards independence was slow up until the mid-20th century. By 1977, 54 African countries had seceded from European colonial rulers. During the World Wars, African soldiers were conscripted into imperial militaries. This led to a deeper political awareness and the expectation of greater respect and self-determination, which was left largely unfulfilled. During the 1941 Atlantic Conference, the British and the US leaders met to discuss ideas for the post-war world. One of the provisions added by President Roosevelt was that all people had the right to self-determination, inspiring hope in British colonies. On February 12, 1941, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met to discuss the post-war world. The result was the Atlantic Charter. It was not a treaty and was not submitted to the British Parliament or the Senate of the United States for ratification, but it turned out to be a widely acclaimed document. One of the provisions, introduced by Roosevelt, was the autonomy of imperial colonies. After World War II, the US and the African colonies put pressure on Britain to abide by the terms of the Atlantic Charter. After the war, some Britons considered African colonies to be childish and immature. British colonizers introduced democratic government at local levels in the colonies. Britain was forced to agree, but Churchill rejected universal applicability of self-determination for subject nations. He also stated that the charter was only applicable to German-occupied states, not to the British Empire. Furthermore, colonies such as Nigeria, Senegal and Ghana pushed for self-governance as colonial powers were exhausted by war efforts. Colonial economic exploitation involved the siphoning off of resource extraction profits to European shareholders at the expense of internal development, causing major local socio-economic grievances. For early African nationalists, decolonization was a moral imperative around which a political power base could be assembled. In the 1930s, the colonial powers had cultivated, sometimes inadvertently, a small elite of local African leaders educated in Western universities, where they became familiar with and fluent in ideas such as self-determination. Although independence was not encouraged, arrangements between these leaders in the colonial powers developed, and such figures as Jomo Kenyatta, Leopold Sedar Senghor came to lead the struggles for African nationalism. During the Second World War, some local African industry and towns expanded when U-boats patrolling the Atlantic Ocean reduced raw material transportation to Europe. Over time, urban communities, industries and trade unions grew, improving literacy and education, leading to pro-independence newspaper establishments. By 1945, the Fifth Pan-African Congress demanded the end of colonialism. And delegates included future presidents of Ghana, Kenya, Malawi and national activists. There is an extensive body of literature that has examined the legacy of colonialism and colonial institutions on economic outcomes in Africa, with numerous studies showing disputed economic effects of colonialism. The economic legacy of colonialism is difficult to quantify and is disputed. Modernization theory posits that colonial powers built infrastructure to integrate Africa into the world economy. However, this was built mainly for extraction purposes. African economies were structured to benefit the colonizer and